Our four canonical Gospels both resemble each other and differ from each other. This has given rise to what scholars call the Synoptic Problem. Synopsis is seeing things together. I'm going to rely on something scholars use called a synopsis of the Gospels. A synopsis arranges side by side similar passages in the four Gospels. Placing them next to each other allows us easily to see where they differ and where they overlap. For display purposes, I'm going to use something available online, a color-coded synopsis of these four Gospels using the Net Bible by a very helpful person named Michael Morrison, who did all this work. The Venn diagram in the middle shows you how passages overlap in the three so-called synoptic Gospels, the ones that are most similar to each other, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Where Matthew has unique passages, Morrison has put them in red type. Where Luke has unique passages, those are in blue. Where Mark's passages are unique, those go in yellow. Actually, he uses light green because yellow is so hard to read. And the overlaps get the colors that overlap. Where there's language that's shared by Matthew and Mark, it's in orange, red plus yellow. Where passages are shared by Matthew and Luke, those get brown. He saves purple for John, which is not on this chart. Where Mark and Luke overlap, those passages are in darker green. Where Matthew, Mark, and Luke all have the same wording, it's in black. And as I've said, passages that are unique to John, because John is the most unusual of the four, those are colored purple. Let's look at that section on Jesus' baptism. It's section 18 in the synopsis. One thing I'd like you to notice is that it's in all four Gospels. Many passages aren't. The coloring demonstrates how much the coverage differs even when the four evangelists are reporting the same event. Look at how much of Matthew is in red. There's a little blue and a lot of purple in John, which means John's language is unique. At the same time, note the orange material in Mark and also in Matthew. The next few verses have a lot more in common. Look at all the black type in Matthew 3:16 and 17, the black type in Mark 1:10 and 11, the black type in Luke 3:21 to 22. That's all overlapping material, not just the general fact that all of them are describing Jesus' baptism, but the specific terms they use. Note the light green here in Mark, where the heavens are torn apart. Torn apart doesn't appear in either Matthew or Luke. Matthew and Luke both have the heavens opening. All four Gospels have the Spirit descending like a dove. Even John includes that language, so it's in black as well. So the verses leading up to Jesus' actual baptism are different in Matthew, but they converge where the baptism itself is explained. Each writer seems to want to craft the scene, introduce it, and interpret it in a somewhat different way. And John's scene departs from the other three, in particulars and in the interpretation that the writer wants to give. That's one important passage, but there are whole sequences of passages where the three, especially synoptic Gospels, line up. Let's start with section 32, Jesus' ministry in Galilee. This is recorded in Matthew 4 and in Mark 1. As we go down the list, first note that Matthew has a lot of introductory material that isn't matched by the others. Then they all get going. Jesus began to preach the message, the kingdom of God is near. Then comes a long stretch in Luke chapter 4, where Jesus preaches in his synagogue and reads Isaiah 61 from the scroll and gets run out of town. That's not in the others. Then we rejoin Matthew and Mark with the reaction of the crowds to Jesus' preaching. The next event in Matthew and Mark is the calling of the 12 disciples. There's a lot of orange here, which means a lot of overlap between Matthew and Mark. Jesus teaches in the synagogue at Capernaum in all three synoptics. And then we have a passage where only Mark and Luke record it. Matthew is silent on the healing of the demon-possessed man in the synagogue. This kind of study is a lot easier yourself on your own screen or with your own book, so I'll leave it there. My point here is that there is significant overlap in Jesus' ministry as all three synoptic gospel writers describe it. Yet each gospel writer also introduces things that the others don't. Each evangelist introduces stories that aren't in the others, and sometimes the sequence is different. A synopsis is not to be confused with a harmony of the Gospels, which takes the various passages in all four Gospels and stitches them together into one timeline. As we'll see, especially with the Gospel of John, this doesn't really work because John's sequence is sometimes dramatically different from the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Here's A.T. Robertson's harmony of the four Gospels. We'll pick it up early on with its section 29, Jesus works his first miracle, which is turning water into wine at the wedding at Cana. Next, will be the first cleansing of the temple at the Passover. Now, this is John chapter 2's account of Jesus clearing the temple. The Synoptics put it at the end of Jesus' career, but John puts it at the beginning. Someone harmonizing the Gospels has a choice. Put it up front, like John does, put it at the end, like the Synoptics do, or, in this case, put them both there, so that Jesus cleanses the temple twice, once at the beginning of his ministry and once near the end. After clearing the temple, we have the exchange with Nicodemus. Now, this is all following the Gospel of John so far. Jesus arrives in Galilee, and the harmonizer follows with all three synoptic accounts of Jesus going to Galilee. Now, in the Synoptics, he does that right after the wilderness. There's no trip to Jerusalem in the middle to clear the temple. There's no conversation with Nicodemus. So in a harmony, you don't get the sense that these events, Jesus going to Galilee, are directly following his temptations. The harmonizer will flip back and forth, going back to John after Cana in Galilee, interrupting Luke's account where Jesus goes to other towns in Galilee and then to Nazareth, with John 4, where Jesus heals the son of an official. Not only do you miss Luke's sequence in this case, you also miss the succession of 7 signs that John is presenting his readers. The effect of a harmony is very different from the effect of reading each gospel on its own. A synopsis is not meant to be read as if it's a harmony. It's meant just as a tool to help you see where the different accounts line up and where writers might have drawn on other writers. For this course, I would discourage you from using a harmony. Instead, just stick with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in their own right. Read each author, get a sense of what each author is trying to get across, and use a synopsis for comparisons of passages for literary purposes. Another long section with pronounced similarities and also interesting differences is the Passion narrative, the story between Jesus' arrest and his burial, which covers all 4 Gospels. You should find a copy of this color-coded synopsis and take a look at it yourself. The Passion narrative starts in section 305. In other places, the Gospels are very different in ways that many Christians have never noticed. Let's look at the birth narratives that are familiar to a lot of people just because they come around at Christmas time. The material on Jesus' birth starts in section 2, where Luke begins with material that Matthew, Mark, and John don't have. This section is about Elizabeth and Zechariah, leading up to the birth of John the Baptist. And it's all only in Luke. Matthew begins in a different place. He's bold-faced here on the left because we're looking at something now in Matthew's order. Matthew starts with a long genealogy from Abraham to Jesus. Luke has a genealogy as well, but it comes later, and it actually goes the other direction, from Jesus all the way to Abraham and past Abraham to Adam. We'll look more at these details when we look at the individual Gospels, because they play significantly different roles in the way each of those writers, Matthew and Luke, is telling Jesus' story. Now we have the stories of Jesus' birth, and I'd like you to notice a few things. There's nothing in Mark or John. Both of them pick up Jesus' story only at his baptism. And notice also how much red is in Matthew's column and how much blue is in Luke's. There's very little overlap. As we go down here, they are giving you very different treatments. Jesus being worshipped by shepherds only occurs in Luke. The visit of the wise men only occurs in Matthew. Also, just for your information, when the wise men from the east come to worship Jesus, they come to his house. Look in 2:11, and they see the child with Mary, his mother. Our churches and our imaginations have fused together details from Matthew's account, where the wise men visit at a house, and details from Luke, where they need to pay a tax, so they end up in Bethlehem. They can't find a room in the inn, and so Jesus is laid in a manger. That detail occurs in Luke, but not Matthew. So what our churches do is we build a creche with details from all of them. They are in a barn with a manger, like in Luke, not a house like in Matthew. The wise men from Matthew are there along with the shepherds from Luke, even though the shepherds from Luke are much closer to Jesus' infancy, whereas it takes the wise men more time to get to the house where Jesus and his family are staying. Luke has Jesus being circumcised on the 8th day and presented at the temple on his 40th day. Matthew omits that. Matthew has the flight into Egypt where Jesus, Mary, and Joseph have to flee the persecution of Herod. They both have different accounts of how the family ends up back in Galilee. Luke fast forwards to when Jesus is 12 and the family visits Jerusalem and they find Jesus in the temple when they've lost him for a few days. It barely registers with most readers of the Gospels how different Matthew's and Luke's accounts of Jesus' infancy are. One likely reason for this is that Mark wrote first, and because he didn't have anything about Jesus' infancy, Matthew and Luke weren't drawing on it. Another place where these Gospels differ is in Matthew's large blocks of teaching. To show you this, I turned the red letter feature on so that the words of Jesus will show up in red. And I'm in the Gospel of Matthew. I've made it small because you don't need to worry about every word. If we look at this, there's a lot of black type, which means Matthew is telling you about what happens. And then look, starting in chapter 5 at the Sermon on the Mount, we have a long stretch of teaching. All of these words are in red because they're all coming from Jesus. 3 chapters worth. And then when the sermon concludes, we go back to mainly black because Matthew is relating stories where Jesus speaks, but he's not just laying down a whole sermon. And then in chapter 10, as Jesus sends out the disciples, here comes another big block of teaching, all in red, a long speech from Jesus, training his disciples. There are 5 of these in Matthew, 5 long teaching blocks. If we look in Mark's gospel, we aren't going to see this kind of thing. We'll see plenty of reporting where Jesus' speech has a part, but no long block of teaching. Not until far in. Here's something that looks close in Mark chapter 4, but even then it's not as long as what we saw in Matthew. Mark 6, Mark 7, some teaching, but not a sermon like we saw in Matthew. In other words, Mark's gospel focuses on narrative. Matthew punctuates his narrative with these 5 long blocks of teaching. When we look later at how much Matthew and Mark have in common, this begs a question. If one is using the other, what's more likely? That Mark is taking out features like the Sermon on the Mount, or that Matthew is adding material to what's already in Mark? Some other distinctive patches of the Gospels are a long travel narrative in the Gospel of Luke, a number of monologues from Jesus in the Gospel of John, whose content is different from that in Matthew, and some very different details in the accounts of the resurrection of Jesus and his appearances to his disciples. We'll look at a number of those when we look at each Gospel so that we can see what's distinct, but if you want to grab a synopsis and look at them yourselves, be my guest. As we've seen, Matthew and Luke basically follow the order in the Gospel of Mark. When Matthew and Luke depart from Mark, they tend to disagree about how. And the Gospel of John consistently brings events from later in Jesus' ministry, according to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, earlier into the narrative. For instance, when Jesus in Jerusalem clears the temple, overturning the tables of the money changers, that happens near the end of his life. In fact, it's one of the reasons that he is crucified. Whereas in John's gospel, it happens near the beginning of his ministry, in John chapter 2. Time after time, details match in the Synoptic Gospels especially. Many stories are found in all 3, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. These are called the triple tradition. Many others are in only 2 of the 3. Some are in all 4, like Jesus' baptism, which we looked at. But even in common stories, details can differ in notable ways. We already looked at some significant differences in how Jesus' baptism is portrayed. Let's look at another famous story, section 254, the rich young man, whom we typically refer to as the rich young ruler. Why do we do that? Well, take a look on Luke's side. In blue, a certain ruler asked him, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" We'll follow Luke's for a while. Jesus responded, "You know the commandments. Keep the commandments." The man said, "I have." When Jesus heard this, he said, "One thing you lack. Sell what you have and give it to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Come, follow me." But when the man heard this, he became very sad, for he was extremely wealthy. In Luke, this man is rich, and he's a ruler. But those descriptions were in blue, weren't they? He's not a ruler in Matthew or Mark. In those 2 Gospels, he's still a rich man. And in Matthew, look at verse 20, he's young. So Mark tells us a story about a rich man. Matthew tells us a story about a rich young man. And Luke tells us a story about a rich ruler. It's reasonable to think that this didn't keep happening in Jesus' career. This happened once. Luke wants to highlight that he's powerful, and Matthew wants to highlight that he's young. And he may be all three. Or it could be that each is spinning this common story in his own characteristic way. And the four evangelists tell the story of Jesus' crucifixion with details that differ sometimes in striking ways. This material is, of course, in all four Gospels, and each has a lot of black type, which means details in common. They also have a lot of their own colors here because they want to tell the story of the cross their ways. In Matthew and Mark, the thieves on either side of Jesus abuse him verbally, but in Luke, one of them doesn't. He turns to Jesus and says, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus says, "Truly, you'll be with me today in paradise." Jesus' words from the cross are different. In Matthew and Mark, Jesus says something in Aramaic, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" That's a quote from Psalm 22, verse 1. Luke doesn't include it. John has not included many of these details, but here Jesus says, "I thirst." And then each gospel writer tells you Jesus' last words. Luke has Jesus saying, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." He sounds in control. In John, he says, "It is finished," or "they are finished." But in Matthew and Mark, Jesus just cries out with a loud voice and breathes his last. Then Matthew gives us a surprising detail that the other Gospels don't. When Jesus breathed his last, there was an earthquake, the rocks were split apart, tombs were opened, and the bodies of many saints who had died were raised. And after his resurrection, they came into town and appeared to many people. So even when the evangelists are obviously recording the same event, there's only one crucifixion, they do it with details that are strikingly different and even incompatible. A widespread tendency is to try to harmonize these differences as best we can, and to just chalk some of it up to the fact that different people remember things in different ways. And some of it can be explained that way, I'm sure. But there are also signs that each evangelist has his own agenda, his own vision of what he wants to emphasize in the telling of this life. There are also signs that some of these writers are familiar with each other's writings. Here's a passage that's a real giveaway. Look at Mark 13:14. "When you see the abomination of desolation standing where it should not be," and then in parentheses, "let the reader understand, then those in Judea must flee to the mountains." This is Jesus talking in Mark 13, and he's not talking to readers. He's saying this orally. So the phrase, "let the reader understand," is coming from Mark, not from Jesus. Now look over in Matthew 24. "So when you see the abomination of desolation," Matthew then explains to his readers, "spoken about by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand, then those in Judea must flee to the mountains." This is not just a shared oral tradition. This is literary dependence. Either Matthew is drawing on Mark, Mark is drawing on Matthew, or both of them are drawing on some other written source. There are other places where they seem to be correcting or changing one another's work. When Jesus is rejected in his own hometown, Mark 6:5 says something startling. He was not able to do a miracle there, except to lay his hands on a few sick people and heal them. And he was amazed because of their unbelief. Okay, Jesus did a few healings, but he wasn't able, he couldn't heal people there. Matthew has a lot of common language in black type, but look how it changes. Matthew 13:58, "And he did not do many miracles there because of their unbelief." We're talking about the same event in Jesus' ministry, but Mark says something more startling and Matthew says something that's closer in line to what we'd expect of Jesus. Not that he can't do miracles, but that he just doesn't do them because of their unbelief. Section 39, where Jesus departs from Capernaum, describes the same event, but as you see, the writers are using their own language to describe it. I'll read Mark in my English Net Bible translation. "Jesus got up early in the morning while it was still dark. He departed, and he went out to a deserted place." The darker green words are shared with Luke. "And there he spent time in prayer. Simon and his companions searched for him, and when they found him, they said, 'Everyone is looking for you.' And he replied, 'Let's go elsewhere, into the surrounding villages, so that I can preach there too. That is what I came here to do.'" Pretty straightforward. What's the problem there? Well, the problem is that the Greek translation has cleaned up some of Mark's syntax. You can actually find an uncleaned up English translation of the New Testament. There's one by a theologian named David Bentley Hart. which will show you in English text that's closer to the Greek originals. Here's his translation. And rising very early in the morning in the darkness, Jesus went out and departed to a deserted place and prayed there. And Simon and those with him hunted for him and found him. And they say to him, everyone is looking for you. Mark does that a lot. He starts a story in the past tense, and then just like we do today when we're telling stories and we get excited, he shifts into the present tense. Luke's Greek is more polished. You're not going to hear that kind of thing from Luke. Luke cleans up Mark's copy. These tendencies add up to distinct, consistent effects through each gospel. A number of readers have noticed how incompetent the disciples seem in the Gospel of Mark. That's not really true in the Gospel of Matthew. Take a look at the leaven of the Pharisees exchange, section 155. Mark 8 tells this story. It's one of the more frustrating stories in this book. Now, they had forgotten to take bread, except for one loaf they had with them in the boat. And Jesus ordered them, watch out, beware of the yeast or the leaven of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod. So the disciples began to discuss with one another about having no bread. What does one thing have to do with the other? You got me. 8:17. When he learned of this, Jesus said to them, why are you arguing about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Have your hearts been hardened? Though you have eyes, don't you see? And though you have ears, can't you hear? Don't you remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many baskets full of pieces did you pick up? 12, they replied. When I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many baskets full of pieces did you pick up? 7. Then he said to them, do you still not understand? That's the end of the passage. It just leaves us with everyone frustrated. But now look at Matthew's account of the same event. When the disciples went to the other side, they forgot to take bread. Watch out, Jesus said to them. Beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So they began to discuss this among themselves, saying, it's because we brought no bread. Here they still don't sound very competent. We're starting off in the same place as in Mark. And when Jesus learned of this, he said, you who have such little faith, why are you arguing about yourselves about having no bread? Do you still not understand? Don't you remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets you took up? Or the 7 loaves for the 4,000, and how many baskets you took up? He doesn't run him down with a quote from Isaiah 6. Having eyes, do you not see? Having ears, do you not hear? And the rest of this passage will explain why. 16:11. How could you not understand that I was not speaking to you about bread, but beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees? Then they understood that he had not told them to be on guard against the yeast in bread, but against the teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Here, biblical scholars need to be detectives. Is there a plausible hypothesis that can account for this evidence? That's where we're going next, what scholars make of all this.